Welcome to Stream of Conscience, brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, where we believe that change is possible and you can make it happen. I'm your host, John Hartwell. For more than a year now, there's been a great hue and cry about deficit reduction, with many on the right proclaiming that America is spending its way into oblivion and that we're only a small step away from economic catastrophe and collapse. Their answer, of course, is to dramatically cut spending, beginning with slashing social programs that benefit the old, the poor, and the sick, like Social Security and Medicare. We're broke, they say, and only by sharply reducing government can we survive and prosper. Well, we're not broke, of course. America still happens to be the richest country the world has ever seen, with vast resources of wealth and creativity. But that doesn't mean that everything is perfect, and we at Democracy for America willingly embrace change. I'm joined today by three of my colleagues in DFA, Elsa Peterson-Nobuchowski, Dan Trofe, and Doug Sutherland, to talk about a recent report by the Institute for Policy Studies called, appropriately, America Isn't Broke: How to Pay for the Crisis While Making the Country More Equitable, Green, and Secure. This study identifies 24 spending cuts and revenue increases that could save over $800 billion a year, all without shredding the social safety net. We're going to talk about some of these proposals today. Dan, Doug, Elsa, welcome to Stream of Conscience.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So, this report from the Institute of Policy Studies has three broad areas that they talk about. Taxing Wall Street and the corporations and rich individuals, cutting military spending, and doing both revenue and cost cutting to help the environment. But amongst those three, we can come up with over $800 billion a year, which over 10 years would be more than $8 trillion, which is double the amount that even the biggest of the go big congressional proponents have talked about. So there's a lot of money here on the table, and we really need to talk about how we can achieve these things. Now, Dan, the first area that we talked about is taxing Wall Street, corporations, and the wealthy. And the Institute for Policy Studies says that we can get nearly $375 billion a year out of just doing that. Tell us what they've got in mind.
Okay, as you say, it's taxing wealth, Wall Street corporations and wealthy individuals. The first area is taxing financial transactions. Now, typically back in the 1970s, the average investor was investing, or the average person buying stock, was buying stock with the idea of holding it for a few months to many, many years. Now, that changed in the 80s and 90s with deregulation and lower financial transaction costs, so that now we have the speculators, the day traders, who are trading many, many times a day and sometimes trading the same stock in a few hours or even minutes. So that this is becoming so prevalent that 55% of transactions are by these people today. And this also drives some of the volatility we're seeing in the market that's been so dramatic.
Yes.
So what we're proposing, or what they're proposing, is a modest tax. And by that I mean a very small amount to the average individual. But it would be significant to these speculators and might suppress some of them, some of their activity. And that could raise, they estimate, $150 billion a year. Okay, the second area is to stop the corporate tax havens. Corporations are supposed to pay 35% in taxes. The actual rate that we figure that they are paying is around 18%. And they do this by overseas subsidiaries and a variety of tax loopholes I won't go into. But the bill called the Stop Tax Haven Abuse Act that is in Congress now, they estimate will save another $100 billion. Okay, the third major area is to tax wealthy individuals in two ways. The first would be to add 5 tax brackets to people making over $1 million. And the second would be to eliminate the tax preferences for capital gains and dividends. The capital gains and dividends tax now is 15%, which is way below the 35% top tax for wealthy individuals. So that's a big benefit to them, but to the average guy whose tax rate is 15 or 20%, they're not benefiting from it at all. So they would eliminate it and just return to taxing income at the usual tax bracket rate. And this prompted Warren Buffett, the abuse of this, to say, stop coddling the super rich. This would raise $79 billion. Now, this, combined with a few other changes like taxing estate taxes on the wealthy, the very wealthy, 5 million, 10 million and up, would raise $375 billion a year.
That's a significant amount of money.
Yes.
Yes. And as you said on the transaction tax, it would be a very, very small amount on each trade.
Right.
And so a normal investor would see very little impact.
Be virtually unnoticeable.
Right.
It would not be a consideration to the average individual whether they were going to buy or sell stock.
Right. But this would have a significant impact on, for example, those who are trading the machine programs that are out there that trade many, many times a day, come in and out of the market very quickly. There would be a significant penalty to that kind of trading.
It would really add up for those people, right? And hopefully would suppress at least some of that activity.
And some of that volatility, as you just pointed out. There was the instance a few months ago when suddenly the market collapsed and then came back, and they're still not sure what was happening there. But
right. Computer-driven.
Computer-driven.
Vast numbers of trades.
Right.
Right.
And now, the tax havens, can you tell us a little bit more about that? What's going on there?
Well, corporations will typically set up subsidiaries or other companies or use overseas banks to shift money or shift profits, really, overseas. And there are a variety of loopholes. I'm not an expert in tax law. I mean, they hire whole departments of people to figure out ways to do this.
Right.
And that's a huge amount of money. And the tax rate being set at 35% for corporations when they're basically paying half that, something's wrong.
Right.
I have a question about that, Dan, because I think I've read people complaining that the United States corporate tax rate is so high that they have no choice but to try to offshore some of their money to take advantage of lower tax rates in other countries. And if the United States would just lower its corporate tax rate, then they wouldn't be driven to do this.
My understanding is our tax rate is not that high compared to other countries, but that I think the basic reason they're doing it isn't because it's so high, it's because they can do it, because the loopholes are there. And if we eliminate the loopholes, we could gain a lot of revenue.
The one here that I think is really very interesting is the thing about capital gains and dividends, because today the rate, I think, is 15%.
Right.
And many of the most wealthy, this is their primary source of income. So if you're working in a job, you're paying Social Security taxes and other kinds of payroll taxes, and you're paying income taxes, and you're paying a lot of money in taxes percentage-wise. But if you're getting all of your money from dividends and capital gains, then your tax rate is much, much lower than everyone else's. That doesn't seem fair to me.
Absolutely.
So I am a strong proponent of taxing capital gains and dividends at the same level as regular income.
Yeah, I mean, essentially they're paying the lowest tax rate that poor people pay with this approach. So
taxing financial transactions, $150 billion. Stopping the tax haven abuse, another $100 billion. The tax brackets for higher incomes and treating capital gains and dividends the same as regular income, another almost $80 billion. Altogether, $375 billion a year we could have in additional revenues every year. So just this one, over 10 years, would be about the same amount of money that the Go Big committee people were talking about, nearly $4 trillion over 10 years.
Right.
So this is something that we should definitely be looking at.
Absolutely.
Now, in addition to raising more revenue, we need to cut spending. And the Institute has some ideas specifically around military spending. And Elsie, you've been taking a look at that.
That's right, yes. So they've identified areas where we could save about $250 billion in military spending. And about half of that would come from ending the war in Afghanistan.
Right.
That is if we bring everybody home, including contractors.
So we have about 100,000 troops in Afghanistan now and another 100,000 contractors, and this says bring them all home.
That's correct, yes. So that's about half of the money right there.
Okay.
There are two other major areas that they looked at where they saw big savings. One is to reduce U.S. overseas military bases, and that includes Iraq, but it also includes the bases that we have in Europe and Asia. They're not talking about taking them away completely. They're talking about reducing them by 1/3. So we would still have 2/3 of the presence that we have. But those two things together, the 1/3 reduction in our bases in countries in Europe and Asia, plus getting everybody out of Iraq, including the contractors, would give us $21 billion there. And the third area that they identified is eliminating military waste and unnecessary weapon systems. And I'm certainly not an expert on weapon systems, but they've quoted people who are analysts who have looked at various weapon systems that we have and at the efficiency of the way military operations are being done, and identified some pretty big areas where we could cut. One is simply cutting outsourcing to defense contractors by only 15%. We'd still be spending 85% of what we're now spending. That alone would save us $30 billion.
Wow.
The other two big areas, we could get more than $40 billion savings by reducing our nuclear arsenal. Again, not getting rid of it completely, but cutting it down to a level that is considered adequate by some respected military analysts that they quoted. And stopping the research and development in procurement of weapons that are considered to be already obsolete right off the drawing board. The use of contractors has exploded over the last 10 years, especially since 9/11. And they're quoting like the Project on Government Oversight and also Taxpayers for Common Sense as sources saying that we're using way too much. We're spending way too much on contractors, or we're using contractors way too much.
Let me jump in here and say that in this report from the Institute of Policy Studies, they have drawn on many other studies that have been done by experts in various fields. So, and you can find this report online. The language in the report itself is very simple, and then there are links to the underlying reports that they have drawn upon. So anyone who wants to find out more, there's plenty of information out there. So these numbers are not simply pulled out of the air. They're in fact the result of different reports and different studies that have been done by different areas of expertise.
That's correct. For example, they're quoting a United Press International poll in March of 2011 that found that 64% of Americans felt that the war in Afghanistan is not worth fighting.
Right. And so that would give us a basis for saying, let's bring all the troops home from Afghanistan, bring home the contractors, because basically the American people are not supporting this war.
Yes, that's almost 2/3 of the American public.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Dan, you were saying before, you had a question about employment in the military.
Yeah, some people say we have to spend this amount of money, particularly in a time when jobs is such a big issue. Doesn't military spending support jobs?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because the Institute for Policy Studies did address that in this report. What they found is that if you take $1 billion and you use it to employ people in the military, you get 11,000 jobs. If you take that same $1 billion and use it in some other areas, such as clean energy, healthcare, or education, you get a lot bigger bang for your buck. You get more than double. You get 29,000 jobs if you invest it in education.
And you get an educated populace
And you get-
instead of
Exactly.
Death and
Win-win.
destruction somewhere
Yeah.
else in the
Yes.
world.
Yeah.
Speaking of
Yeah.
which, and that brings us to more of a long-term view of what we're doing to a generation of people by sending them off to war,
Right.
and that we have a legacy from Vietnam of people who are having trouble coping with life decades after the war is over, and we're sowing the seeds of the same kind of problem now with people coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, right here in Connecticut, there's actually a very good program called Homes for the Brave that's being run through the VA in West Haven, helping homeless veterans to get housing and to find apartments. And they have estimated that we have between 3,000 and 4,000 homeless veterans just right here in Connecticut.
Wow. And those costs, of course, are not addressed in this report because they're not places that we can cut. Those costs from those wars are going to continue for the next 40, 50, 60 years.
Right.
And we can basically consider them sunk costs. There's nothing we can do to undo that.
But the sooner we bring people home, the sooner we
Yeah.
stop.
So
Right.
we can stop that bleeding.
Yeah. Can I mention another cost that's often overlooked? Paul Krugman has written about this, in that when you spend money on the military, other than defending your country, you're getting almost no economic value out of it.
Right.
You're building a bridge, you're educating people at home, healthcare, even if it's done inefficiently, adds economic value.
Right. Well, so we have revenues that we can raise. We have definitely costs that we can stop spending money on. And Doug, you looked at the third area, which is around the environment. And here we have a combination of ingredients: revenues
Right.
we can raise and costs we can stop spending money on. Tell us about that.
Right. Basically, this is centering around taxing pollution and eliminating harmful government subsidies. And just like the other two areas, too, we're also in the process trying to foster things that will be beneficial to the country, like reducing pollution, promoting clean air and water, reducing our dependence on foreign energy sources, and reducing dependence on dangerous and unsustainable energy sources. So the proposals that they have made, the first one is taxing the carbon content of fossil fuels. And this would be done by applying a modest tax to coal, oil, and natural gas. These are things that we know pollute the environment. And so they estimate that we could raise $75 billion annually if we applied such a tax to fossil fuel carbon content. The next thing is taxing other activities that pollute the air and the water. There are a lot of industries that are not following good environmental practices. They estimate we could raise $38 billion by taxing those activities. And the third thing is $7 billion by increasing fees on the use of public resources. There are a lot of industries that are making private profits off of use of public lands for oil drilling, gas drilling. We have industries that are making money off of the public airways for the radio spectrum. So we could, they estimate $7 billion if we increase taxes on those uses of public resources. So those are three things that are revenue enhancers.
Right.
Okay, and in addition to that, they are looking at current government subsidy programs, which are not really beneficial in the long run. The first one is eliminating federal subsidies to fossil fuels, the nuclear industry, and other dubious energy sources. Currently we're subsidizing coal, big oil, natural gas. Those are all profitable industries. Why are we continuing to use taxpayer dollars to subsidize those? We also backstop the nuclear industry. The federal government is the insurer of last resort. So if there's a natural disaster, right now we currently are the insurer for that industry. We subsidize technologies such as clean coal, which really haven't been proven to be all that effective. Coal is a dirty source of energy. You really can't paint a pretty picture there, and you can waste a lot of money trying to. And the last one there is, we subsidize the ethanol industry, where basically we're taking a food source and turning it into fuel, which is really a very small part of our energy portfolio and really doesn't make a lot of sense. So they're estimating $41 billion could be saved by stopping those subsidy programs. And finally, they're saying we can raise $35 billion by eliminating subsidies for wasteful agriculture, transportation, and other unproductive land use policies. Right now we subsidize agriculture. It mostly goes to corporate farms. It doesn't help small farmers. Most of those corporate farms are not environmentally friendly, and they're not moving towards sustainable, productivity. And so that's an area that we can save on. We're subsidizing inefficient transportation and preventing industries from moving to more efficient transportation by doing that. And finally, we subsidize bad practices in land use by offering things like cheap flood insurance, which only encourages people to develop in areas that are in flood zones. So they're estimating $35 billion from that. So all told, with the revenue enhancing and eliminating wasteful subsidies, almost $200 billion annually.
And just to point out, in the healthcare debate last year, people were saying it was going to cost more than $100 billion a year to provide healthcare for everybody in the country. Here we have $200 billion a year just from not giving money to the fossil fuel industry, to clean coal, so-called, taxing carbon, doing things that are going to move us away from bad practices and toward more healthy practices. And yet we can't seem somehow to find the money to provide health care, but we're able to give money to corporate farms. It doesn't make sense to me.
Just amazing.
It really is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, we've got here three major areas from this report. The taxing corporations and the rich, cutting military spending, and then rebalancing basically our environmental policies so that we
trying to make the playing field level for the energy industry.
The playing field level for the kinds of energy that we need going forward.
Could I make a point on that?
Absolutely.
Conservatives often talk about, of course they're always talking about the free market. And this really, eliminating these subsidies makes it a more genuine market, doesn't it? By making the competition fair, including all the costs in carbon.
And that's what we haven't done, is include all the costs. And we distort the market when we put in subsidies, and we're distorting the market in the wrong direction towards subsidies, toward practices that are not making us any safer or any healthier. And we're continuing to shovel money in directions that we don't need to.
Absolutely.
Well, this is terrific. This report from the Institute of Policy Studies is available online. It's basically an easy read. Yes, there's a lot of numbers in it, but it's, I think, very well presented. It makes a lot of sense. If you're interested in finding out more, if you want to go into greater detail, all of the supporting documents are there. You can find those as well very easily online. And I suggest to everybody that you take a look at this, because what we've been sold up until now is that the only way out of the problems we have is to slash the social safety net. And that simply isn't true. That isn't necessary, and it certainly isn't desirable. We should be addressing things to make our society more equitable, safer, and better run down the road. So thanks very much for everybody for coming in today. It's a terrific discussion, and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I was shocked to see that the so-called super committee didn't reach agreement on deficit reduction. Weren't the hopes and fears of a nation riding on their shoulders? Wasn't it their sworn duty to come together and lead us out of the deficit darkness? Not really. The super committee was designed to fail. Or, to put it another way, the super committee was designed to succeed, but in this case, success had nothing to do with a deficit deal. What we've been watching the last 2 months is political theater at its most crass, hyped by media frenzy on steroids needing to fill up the 24-hour news cycle. Neither side expected or wanted a deal, though for completely different reasons, a fact that should have been clear to even the most casual observer. Let's take a quick look at the key indicators. First, there was the selection process. The 4 party leaders chose the super committee members in a game of I pick my guys, you pick yours. These are the same leaders, by the way, who have been unable or unwilling to craft a deal in the first place, and their loyalty is clearly to seeing their side win rather than finding a compromise. Had they really wanted to break the deadlock and negotiated a deal, they really trusted their colleagues to approach our fiscal problems fairly and find a reasonable solution, They could have used a radically different approach to staffing the committee. It's called, I pick your guys, you pick mine. Think about it. If Harry Reid, the Democratic leader in the Senate, had chosen the 3 Republicans instead of members of his own party, you can bet that a reactionary like Arizona's John Kyle or the former Club for Growth leader Pat Toomey wouldn't have gotten the nod. More likely would have been centrist Republicans like Susan Collins of Maine or Richard Lugar of Indiana. And if Republican Speaker John Boehner had chosen the Democratic House members, he would have tapped more fiscally conservative backbench Dems like Jim Himes over liberal members of the leadership like Jim Clyburn or Chris Van Hollen. In each case, they would have looked for people from the other side whose views are closest to their own, people in the middle, people who understand that compromise means giving something up to reach a deal that everyone can live with. Instead, both sides, but especially the Republicans, loaded up with ideologues who were in no mood to compromise, and gridlock was assured from the beginning. But it wasn't just the composition of the committee that revealed this exercise as a farce. More important was the fact that the purported consequences of failure, the automatic sequestration of funds from both the military and domestic programs, are never going to take place. That's because these automatic cuts aren't scheduled to start until January 2013, more than a year from now, and conveniently after the next election brings a new Congress and possibly a new president. Everybody on the Hill knows that what one Congress takes away, the next Congress can give back, and thus the supposed consequences were meaningless. There was never any real pressure to reach a deal. So, what was the point? Why the charade? Because both sides are playing a high-stakes game where failure in the short run could lead to a much bigger partisan win down the road. For Republicans, holding firm against tax increases demanded by Democrats is very popular with their Tea Party base, and they think they can hold the House next year, have a shot at taking back the Senate, as well as ousting Obama, giving them complete control of the government and allowing them to slash and burn at will. For Dems, the game is similar, but the playbook is different. The big prize for them, beyond keeping Obama in office, is making sure that Bush tax cuts expire next December, as currently legislated. They know that just this one policy change will provide enormous amounts of tax revenue and take the pressure off making cuts elsewhere. So the failure of the super committee simply sets the stage for next year's election. Republicans will run on cutting taxes and spending, Democrats will defend popular programs and beat up on the rich, and nothing will happen in the meantime. I hope you enjoy the show. This has been a Stream of Conscience commentary. I'm John Hartwell. Thanks for watching. That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. If you live in the town served by Cablevision from Norwalk, you can catch our show every Wednesday on Channel 88 at 6:30 p.m. If you're interested in learning more about progressive political action in Fairfield County, please check out our Democracy for America group. We meet the first Wednesday of the month, 7 to 9 p.m. at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk. We always welcome new members. Remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience, and I'm your host, John Hartwell. We hope to see you again soon.